Gabriel arrived home later than usual, the office unusually chaotic for a Thursday night. He placed his keys quietly on the table, kicking off his shoes. Just as he was about to call out to Daisy and announce his arrival, he heard her voice, soft, low, and urgent. She was on the phone, her tone unlike anything he'd ever heard before. He was about to step into the kitchen when her words stopped him in his tracks. The Hitman will be parked by the crosswalk he uses each morning. Gabriel froze, disbelief rooting him to the spot. It'll look like a tragic accident, Daisy continued, her voice cool and calculated. Insurance pays triple for violent crime. Once he's gone, we'll be filthy rich with our kids. The words hung in the air, cold and heavy. He felt his heart hammering in his chest, each beat a painful reminder of what he'd just heard. The calmness in her voice, the calculated tone, she was talking about him. Silently, Gabriel took a step back, slipping into the shadows. He took a deep, unsteady breath, his mind racing. This couldn't be real. This was Daisy, his wife of 18 years, the mother of his children. He felt like he was in a nightmare, but each word he'd just heard was painfully clear. Daisy's voice continued, a soft murmur through the walls. Yes, the crosswalk at 8 a.m. He's always there at the same time. No, it'll look like a freak accident. They'll never trace it back to us. Her voice was chilling, a tone he'd never heard from her before. She sounded like a stranger. Gabriel leaned closer, trying to hear the other end of the conversation. He couldn't make out much, but he caught snippets of a deep, unfamiliar voice, laughing quietly, a twisted intimacy in the sound. He recognized what that was. Her lover. A flood of memories surged through his mind. He thought of their wedding day, her radiant smile as she'd walked down the aisle. He thought of the nights they'd stayed up late, sharing dreams and plans. He thought of his children, their laughter, their little quirks, all the moments he thought were built on love. But now, in an instant, it was shattered, replaced by a dark, bitter realization. All of it was a lie. He backed away, barely able to breathe, making his way to the living room. He sat down, his mind spinning. Every memory, every word she'd ever spoken to him, now felt tainted. He rubbed his temples, forcing himself to stay calm, to process what he'd just heard. He felt his phone buzz in his pocket, but ignored it, too consumed by the twisting emotions inside him. The hallway light flicked on, and Gabriel quickly straightened, composing himself as Daisy stepped into the room. She smiled, oblivious. "Hey," she said, walking toward him, casually brushing her hair behind her ear. "You're home a bit late." He swallowed, masking the tension behind a tight smile. "Yeah, work ran late." "Oh, well," she replied, shrugging. "Glad you're back." She leaned in and kissed his cheek, her touch feeling like ice against his skin. He forced himself to stand still, to not pull away. His mind was racing with questions, but he bit his tongue. He had to act as though nothing had changed. "I'm just going to grab a shower," she said, glancing toward the stairs. "Yeah, sure," he replied, his voice distant. As she disappeared upstairs, he let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. Alone, he felt the weight of her betrayal press down on him, the anger slowly giving way to something else, a cold determination. He moved to the study, closed the door behind him, and sank into the chair. He opened his laptop, his fingers moving almost automatically. His mind was already planning, forming a strategy. He couldn't go to bed that night, not while she slept beside him, knowing what she was planning. He would play along, he decided. He'd make her think he was none the wiser. And in the meantime, he'd prepare. If she wanted to betray him, to destroy everything they'd built, he would make her pay. Just then, he heard footsteps on the stairs. He quickly closed the laptop, standing up as she appeared in the doorway, smiling faintly, wrapped in her robe. "Everything okay?" she asked, tilting her head. "Yeah, just wrapping up some emails," he replied, keeping his tone light. He forced himself to look at her, meeting her gaze. "You heading to bed?" She murmured, nodding. "Come on up soon?" "I'll be there in a bit," he said. He waited until she was out of sight before exhaling, his fists clenched. Gabriel lay awake, staring into the darkness. The faint rhythm of Daisy's breathing beside him filled the silence, each breath twisting the knife deeper. He couldn't make sense of it. 18 years together, and yet here he was, listening to the steady rise and fall of her chest, feeling as if he were lying next to a stranger. Memories washed over him, relentless and cruel. He thought of the long nights up with the kids, rocking them to sleep while she watched with that tired but loving smile. All of it seemed unreal now, like a dream. How had he missed this? How long had it all been a lie? He clenched his fists, trying to keep his breathing steady. His mind kept drifting to the kids, his kids, he thought bitterly. But were they his? The question twisted in his gut. He glanced over at Daisy, lying peacefully, oblivious to his turmoil. How long had she known he wasn't their father? Did she ever plan to tell him? Did the kids know? The questions felt endless, and none of them had answers. Morning eventually came, sunlight filtering through the blinds, and Gabriel slipped out of bed, moving quietly so as not to wake her. He went downstairs, where he stood in the kitchen, staring blankly at the coffee machine, barely aware of the world around him. His thoughts were racing, yet he felt numb. He poured himself a cup, his hand trembling slightly as he took a sip. He had to know the truth. He couldn't confront her, not yet. He needed proof, something concrete to understand the full scope of her betrayal. The idea that he might never know haunted him. That morning, after Daisy left for work, he called a private investigator. "I need answers," he said into the phone, his voice steady, though his insides were churning. "My wife, I think she's been having an affair. And I need to know about my children, too. I can't give you all the details over the phone, but..." The investigator interrupted gently. "I understand, Mr. Hayes. I'll get started right away. I'll need some details about her daily schedule, any known associates you're suspicious of, anything you think might help." Gabriel provided what he could, and as he hung up, a sense of relief washed over him. Finally, he was doing something. No more guessing. No more lying beside her, haunted by questions he was afraid to ask. Soon, he would know the truth. The next few days passed in a haze. He went through the motions, getting up, going to work, spending time with the kids, all the while hiding the anger and grief that simmered beneath the surface. He and Daisy barely spoke, each exchange feeling hollow, forced. She seemed not to notice his distance, too absorbed in her own world. By the end of the week, the investigator called him with an update. "Mr. Hayes, I have quite a bit of information for you," the investigator said, his voice cautious, as if bracing for Gabriel's reaction. "Your wife, she's been involved with a man named Marcus. They've been seeing each other for nearly 20 years. Gabriel gripped the edge of his desk, the weight of the words hitting him like a physical blow. 20 years, he repeated, barely able to process it. "Yes, sir," the investigator confirmed. "It appears they've been involved since before your marriage. There's more. I believe you might want to sit down." Gabriel sank into his chair, bracing himself. "Your children, there's reason to believe they aren't biologically yours." For a moment, Gabriel couldn't speak. He felt the floor fall away from beneath him. The room felt cold for him. He looked around, taking in the framed family photos on the wall, each one now tainted with this new, bitter knowledge. "Are you sure?" he finally managed to ask, his voice barely a whisper. "Yes, sir. There are records, DNA tests that she and Marcus had done privately. It's all documented. I can send you the files." He didn't remember much of the rest of the conversation. The investigator spoke, but the words blurred together. When he hung up, he sat there, staring at his hands, his mind replaying every moment, every smile, every look between him and Daisy. She had lied to him every day, every night. She'd built their entire life on deceit. Later that night, when Daisy came home, she smiled at him, oblivious, as she hung up her coat. "Long day?" she asked, placing her bag on the counter. Gabriel nodded, forcing himself to return the smile. "Yeah, you know how work can be." She laughed lightly. "Tell me about it. I had a client who wouldn't stop calling today. Honestly, sometimes I think people forget we're human." He watched her, barely able to process how easily she spoke, how normal everything seemed. For a brief moment, he wanted to scream, to demand answers, to shatter the calm facade she wore. But he held back, forcing himself to stay calm. "Well, I'll leave you to it," she said, moving toward the stairs. "I think I'll go up early tonight." "Good idea," he replied, his voice even. As she disappeared up the stairs, he clenched his fists, feeling a storm of emotions building inside him. He walked into the living room, staring at the family photos on the wall. His heart ached as he looked at the kids' faces, remembering every milestone, every moment of pride, every time he'd held them, believing he was their father. He sat down, the silence pressing down on him. There was no going back now. The truth was out, and he would have to face it. The realization that he needed to act decisively grounded Gabriel. Beneath his rage, something steadier took hold. Resolve. This wouldn't be a simple call to the police or a hasty confrontation. No, Gabriel wanted Daisy and Marcus to feel the weight of their deception, to experience consequences as deeply as he'd experienced betrayal. First, he set about gathering every piece of evidence he could find. It wasn't difficult. Daisy had grown careless over the years, taking his trust for granted. He started with her phone, discreetly reading her messages with Marcus late at night while she slept. He combed through emails, and each discovery fueled his anger further. "Meet me at the usual spot," read one message from Marcus, sent only days earlier. "Gabriel, out tonight, so I'll swing by," Daisy had replied, adding a heart emoji at the end. Gabriel took photos of everything, cataloging it on a drive he kept hidden. Each piece of evidence was a reminder of the years they'd stolen from him, of the family he believed in. He felt a kind of satisfaction in organizing it all. Every message, every call log he saved was another step toward justice. But he knew he'd need more than just evidence to ensure that Daisy and Marcus faced the full consequences. Over the next few days, Gabriel worked closely with a lawyer, quietly moving assets into accounts she couldn't touch. They worked carefully, disguising each transfer, ensuring Daisy wouldn't notice anything amiss. Each small success felt like a victory, as though he were finally taking back control. One evening, about a week into his plan, Gabriel found Daisy in the kitchen, chopping vegetables for dinner. He stepped in, adopting an easy smile, masking the storm brewing within him. He leaned against the counter, watching her. "How's your day been?" he asked casually. Daisy looked up, smiling back as though nothing in their world had changed. "Oh, the usual, just errands." She turned back to the cutting board, unaware of his scrutiny. "Sounds busy," he replied, carefully keeping his tone light. "You should take a break sometime, get some rest." She laughed, brushing it off. "Maybe someday. You know how it is. Kids, work, life, it's all a juggling act." Gabriel nodded, fighting the urge to confront her right then and there. He clenched his jaw, pushing down the surge of disgust he felt. Now wasn't the time. If he was going to make her pay, he needed to act carefully, without tipping her off. Over the next week, Gabriel continued to gather everything he could. He obtained financial records, phone logs, and even hired a digital forensic expert to retrieve older messages between Daisy and Marcus. The evidence was damning. Their affair stretched back years, dates and places recorded with painful precision. He felt a strange satisfaction with each piece of evidence he added to his growing file. One evening, while Daisy was out, he sat down with his lawyer, ready to finalize his plans. He placed a thick folder of documents on the table, and the lawyer flipped through it, nodding approvingly. "This is substantial," the lawyer said, looking up at Gabriel. "We can proceed with full asset protection. Once you're ready to confront her, you'll have everything legally in place." Gabriel nodded, his face set. "I don't want her or Marcus to touch a cent of my money. Not a single penny." The lawyer gave a faint smile. "Consider it done. Once we finish this process, they'll have nothing to fall back on, and you'll be protected." That night, when Daisy came home, Gabriel watched her carefully as she moved through the house, completely oblivious to the web closing around her. He felt a strange sense of detachment, watching her laugh with the kids, her face bright and relaxed. He couldn't understand how she could carry on so easily, so unaffected by what she was doing. A few nights later, he found her texting in the living room, her face illuminated by her phone screen. She looked up, smiling, but he could see the faint flicker of guilt in her eyes. "Who's keeping you so busy?" he asked, his voice light. "Oh, just one of the moms from school," she replied, slipping her phone into her pocket. She had some questions about the bake sale coming up. He nodded, watching her lie so smoothly, as if it were second nature. But he kept his own face impassive, nodding as if he believed her. "Well, I'm glad you're involved," he said, smiling faintly. "It's good to see you so dedicated." Daisy's smile faltered for a split second, but she recovered quickly, nodding in agreement. "Of course, you know how much I love the community stuff." Inside, Gabriel felt a flicker of dark amusement. She had no idea what was coming. She had no idea that each word she spoke, each lie she told, only tightened the trap he was setting for her. As the days passed, he prepared for the final steps. He coordinated with authorities, ensuring that when the time came, both Daisy and Marcus would be held accountable. He made arrangements, setting everything up for when he would reveal the truth. It was just a matter of timing now. One evening, while they sat across from each other at dinner, Gabriel looked up, meeting Daisy's gaze. "Have you ever thought about taking a break?" he asked suddenly, his voice casual. She blinked, caught off guard. "A break? Just to get away? I thought maybe a trip would be good for you." She laughed, brushing it off. "Oh, I don't think that's necessary. Besides, the kids have school, and there's so much going on at work. Still, it's good to step back sometimes," he said, watching her closely. She looked down, avoiding his gaze, and he knew he'd struck a nerve. She sensed something, but he kept his expression neutral, calm. There was nothing for her to see, nothing that would give away his plans. As he cleared the table that night, his resolve only strengthened. Soon, everything would fall into place. The evidence, the legal protections, the hidden assets, he had laid the foundation, and he was ready to watch it all unfold. The morning of Daisy's planned betrayal arrived cool and misty, an ordinary day draped in shades of gray. Gabriel went about his routine carefully, acting as if it were just another morning. He moved through the motions, shaving, getting dressed, sipping his coffee, while keeping an eye on Daisy, who was downstairs making breakfast, her face calm. He could almost believe it was any other day, that her smile was genuine, that she hadn't plotted to end his life. But he knew better. With a final glance around the house, he picked up his keys and left, heading toward the crosswalk. He kept his steps measured, his expression neutral, even as his heart hammered against his ribs. Everything had been prepared. His lawyer, the private investigator, and the authorities had all coordinated with him to bring this plan to a close. If everything went right, today would mark the end of Daisy and Marcus's schemes. As he approached the crosswalk, he spotted the undercover officers, dressed inconspicuously, blending in with the morning foot traffic. They gave no indication that anything was amiss, nodding slightly as he walked past, the subtle acknowledgement giving him a sliver of reassurance. The air felt thick, tense with unspoken words and hidden motives. He took a deep breath, calming himself. Up ahead, parked by the curb near the crosswalk, was a black sedan. Gabriel's pulse quickened. This had to be the hitman. The man behind the wheel was barely visible, a shadowy figure with a baseball cap pulled low over his face. Gabriel felt his jaw clench, forcing himself to keep his pace steady, even as anger simmered inside him. He approached the crosswalk, pausing just long enough to let the light turn in his favor. He stepped forward, his gaze fixed on the horizon, pretending not to notice the car inching forward. He saw the man in the driver's seat shift, his hand twitching as he prepared to carry out his orders. But before he could act, the silence shattered. "Police! Step out of the vehicle. Hands where we can see them." The command rang out, firm and unyielding. Within seconds, officers converged on the car, their weapons drawn. The driver's face twisted in shock as he raised his hands, realizing too late that his plan had failed. Gabriel watched from a safe distance as the hitman was dragged out of the car, his expression a mixture of fury and confusion. "What is this?" the hitman snarled, struggling against the officer's grip. "You're under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder," one of the officers said, voice cold and steady. "Let's go." Gabriel stood there, watching as they cuffed the man, feeling an odd sense of satisfaction. He was safe. The plan had unfolded perfectly. But he wasn't done yet. He returned home later that day, his mind focused, his heart set. He had laid the groundwork, gathered the evidence, and now it was time to confront Daisy. He found her in the living room, engrossed in her phone, the picture of innocence. She looked up as he entered, offering a smile that almost made him sick with the irony. "You're home early," she said casually, putting her phone down. Gabriel met her gaze, holding back the storm of emotions swirling inside him. He smiled, forcing himself to appear calm. "Yeah, thought I'd take the afternoon off. Thought maybe we could talk." A flicker of unease crossed her face, but she nodded, still playing along. "Sure, what's up?" He walked over to the couch and sat across from her, keeping his expression neutral. Daisy entered, smiling faintly as she shrugged off her coat, unaware of what lay ahead. But as her eyes adjusted to the dim light and she saw the serious look on his face, her smile faltered. "Gabriel? Is everything all right?" she asked, her voice tinged with unease. Gabriel didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached to his side, where he'd placed the thick folder of evidence he'd been compiling for weeks. He set it down on the coffee table between them and looked up, his gaze piercing. "Sit down, Daisy," he said quietly. She hesitated, clearly sensing that something was wrong. Slowly, she lowered herself into the armchair across from him, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "What's going on?" she asked, her voice wavering. Without a word, Gabriel opened the folder, revealing the collection of documents, screenshots, and photos that he had gathered. He pushed it toward her, watching her expression shift from confusion to shock as she began flipping through the pages. "How long did you think you could keep this up, Daisy?" he demanded, his voice low but seething with restrained fury. "How long were you going to lie to my face? Plan behind my back?" Daisy's face went pale as she looked through the evidence, each page a reminder of her lies. Her hands shook as she placed the folder back on the table, unable to meet his gaze. "Gabriel, please," she whispered, her voice barely audible. I didn't mean for it to go this far." He clenched his fists, fighting to keep his composure. "You didn't mean for it to go this far?" he repeated, bitterness lacing every word. "You plotted to kill me, Daisy. You and your lover. You took nearly 2 decades of my life and twisted it all into a lie. And our children." His voice broke slightly, but he quickly composed himself, swallowing the raw pain. Daisy's eyes filled with tears as she finally looked up at him, desperation evident in her expression. She shook her head, struggling to find the words. "Gabriel, please," she choked out, her voice trembling. It wasn't supposed to be like this. I was confused." "Confused?" Gabriel shot back, incredulous. "You conspired to have me killed. You spent years lying to me. Was that all confusion too?" Daisy broke down, her hands covering her face as the tears streamed down. She sank to her knees, her shoulders shaking as she sobbed openly. "Gabriel, I'm begging you," she said, her voice muffled. "For the kids, please. Don't do this to us." Her pleas fell like lead on his heart, but he felt nothing but anger and betrayal. He thought of every moment he'd trusted her, every sacrifice he'd made for their family. All those moments now felt like bitter illusions. "The kids," he echoed, his voice cold. "You mean the kids you lied to me about? The ones you had with Marcus?" He shook his head, his tone filled with resignation. "I raised them. I thought they were mine, and you let me believe that lie." Daisy's sobbing grew more frantic, her hands reaching out toward him. "I'll end things with him. I'll cut him out of our lives, I swear," she promised, her voice frantic. Just don't walk away from us. Don't tear our family apart." "Our family," he scoffed, bitterness seeping into his words. "There was never an U.S., Daisy. The moment you started lying, the moment you decided my life was disposable, you ended any chance of this family." She looked up at him, her face streaked with tears, and reached out again. "Please, Gabriel, we can fix this. I'll do anything." But Gabriel's gaze remained hard, unyielding. "There's no going back," he said quietly, each word hitting her like a blow. "You destroyed everything the moment you betrayed me." Daisy crumpled, her hands clenching the fabric of her dress as she sobbed uncontrollably. "Gabriel, please, I'm begging you," she whispered, her voice hoarse with desperation. "I love you, I always have." A bitter laugh escaped him. "Love? You call this love? You lied to me for nearly 20 years, Daisy. You made me believe in a life, a family, that was never real. You plotted to end my life for your own gain. That's not love. That's betrayal. Daisy looked up, her face filled with panic, her voice barely above a whisper. Please, I'll change. I'll be the wife you deserve. Just give me a chance. He shook his head, feeling the weight of finality settle over him. You don't get to rewrite this, Daisy. You've already written the ending. With that, he stood, leaving her sobbing on the floor, broken by the harsh truth she could no longer deny. As he walked away, he felt a strange sense of release, a lightness he hadn't felt in years. He was done with the lies, done with the illusion, and for the first time, he felt free. Daisy and Marcus's arrest happened quietly, but had loud consequences. The authorities took them in without spectacle, but the news spread quickly. By the next day, their names were splashed across headlines, their photos on every screen. It wasn't long before the phone calls started, each conversation an echo of shock, anger, and disgust. Gabriel read the reports online, skimming the scathing comments, the relentless judgments. He felt a strange detachment from it all. He was part of this story, but now he observed it as if from a distance, a spectator to a scandal that had once been his life. In a small, dimly lit cell, Daisy sat alone, staring at the gray walls around her. Her mind spun, filled with regret and disbelief. She'd been stripped of everything, her family, her friends, her home, and all the wealth she had once coveted. She had tried calling a few friends, people she thought would stand by her, but each call ended in the same way. Shocked silence, then an excuse, a hasty goodbye. One evening, Marcus managed to get a message to her through the prison's tightly controlled communication channels. She hadn't spoken to him since their arrest, and the familiarity of his voice filled her with a brief sense of comfort, only to be followed by a crushing wave of despair. Daisy, he said, his voice sounding tired, defeated. We need to figure out what we're going to do. We can't stay here. And do what, Marcus? She replied, her tone bitter. This is our life now. You do realize that, don't you? It's over. He hesitated. It doesn't have to be. We just need to keep our heads down, get through this. Maybe there's still a way out. A way out, she laughed bitterly. Do you even hear yourself? We've lost everything. Gabriel took it all. She paused, her voice dropping to a whisper. My kids don't even want to speak to me. I've called, I've written, and they won't respond. They'll come around, he said, though the lack of conviction in his voice was clear. No, Marcus. They won't, Daisy replied, her voice breaking. I destroyed everything. And for what? Marcus fell silent, the weight of her words sinking in. There was nothing he could say. Their partnership, once a dark and thrilling secret, was now their shared prison. He wanted to comfort her, but he had nothing left to offer. Finally, he said, I'm sorry, Daisy. She stared at the ceiling, feeling the full impact of her choices settling over her. It's too late for that. Meanwhile, Gabriel was finding something he hadn't known he was missing: freedom. He'd spent so many years entangled in Daisy's web of lies, carrying the weight of a family he'd thought was his own. But now, as painful as the truth had been, he felt a new lightness, a strange sense of possibility. One afternoon, Gabriel met with an old friend, Ezekiel, at a quiet cafe in town. Ezekiel had been one of the few people who had supported him through the ordeal, offering quiet solidarity and distraction during the roughest nights. Now, Ezekiel looked at him with something approaching relief. You look, well, better, Ezekiel said, studying Gabriel's face. Gabriel nodded, a small smile touching his lips. I feel better. I didn't think it was possible, but there's a certain peace in finally knowing the truth. You deserve this, you know. You deserve a fresh start, Ezekiel said, his tone earnest. You've spent too long putting everyone else first. Gabriel took a sip of his coffee, nodding slowly. It's strange, but I don't even feel angry anymore. I think I've finally let it go. They sat in comfortable silence for a while before Ezekiel's face lit up with a mischievous grin. So, anyone new on the horizon? Gabriel laughed, shaking his head. I don't know if I'm ready for that yet. As the months passed, Daisy and Marcus faded into a distant memory. They lived out their days in isolation, each trapped in their own cycle of regret. The friends who had once been part of their lives no longer returned their calls, and even their families refused to visit. They were left to confront their own choices, the consequences of their betrayal weighing heavily on them. Meanwhile, Gabriel moved forward, finding new meaning and purpose. He learned to appreciate the quiet moments, the small joys, and the promise of new beginnings. And as he stood at the edge of this new chapter, he felt a peace that he hadn't thought possible, a feeling of hope that perhaps, this time, he'd found something real. Months had passed, months where Gabriel had rebuilt his life, slowly finding peace and a sense of purpose that he hadn't felt in years. Daisy's betrayal was still a scar, but it had started to fade. His days were spent with new friends and meaningful work. Yet, one evening, he received a message that pulled him momentarily back into the past. A desperate note from Daisy, asking him to meet her one last time. Curiosity gnawed at him. Against his better judgment, he decided to go. They arranged to meet at a small, nearly empty cafe on the outskirts of town, a place they had never gone together during their marriage. As he stepped inside, he saw her immediately. Daisy sat at a corner table by the window, gazing down at her hands, her shoulders hunched. Gabriel approached slowly, taking in the sight of her. She looked worn, far from the vibrant, confident woman he once knew. Her hair hung limply, and there were dark circles under her eyes. She looked up as he neared, offering him a strained, uncertain smile. "Gabriel," she whispered as he sat across from her, her voice hoarse. "Thank you for coming." He nodded, feeling a flicker of pity despite everything she had done. "What do you want, Daisy?" She seemed to struggle with her words, her hands fidgeting on the table. "I know I don't deserve this, even just seeing you. She paused, searching his face. "I needed to see you one last time." "Why?" he asked flatly, his tone giving away none of the emotions brewing inside him. She hesitated, looking down at her hands. "I don't expect forgiveness. I know I don't deserve it. But I wanted you to know, I'm sorry, Gabriel. For everything. For the lies, the betrayal, all of it." Her voice cracked, and she took a shaky breath. "I threw away everything that mattered, and I'll never stop regretting it." He listened in silence, his face impassive. She looked up, her eyes red and pleading. "Please," she continued, barely above a whisper. "Can you ever forgive me?" Gabriel met her gaze, feeling a strange mixture of emotions. There was a time when he would have longed to hear her say those words. Now, however, they felt hollow. "Forgive you," he repeated, his tone cold. "Forgive you for what? For the years of lies? For letting me think I had a family with you, only to find out it was all a sham?" Daisy flinched, her face crumbling. I know I've hurt you in ways I can't ever fix. But Gabriel, we did have something once, didn't we?" She clasped her hands together, as though she were praying. "I know I can never change what I did, but I'm lost, Gabriel. I don't have anyone. I thought if I could just see you, maybe." He cut her off, a faint bitterness creeping into his voice. "You mean if I could make you feel better? Give you a way out of your guilt? Make it easier for you to sleep at night?" He shook his head slowly. "No, Daisy. You had every chance to be honest, to be loyal. You threw it all away. You chose this." Her face twisted in anguish. "Please," she begged, her voice breaking. "I know you're angry, but I was so lost back then. I was confused, and Marcus, he was just, I thought." She trailed off, her words faltering as she looked at him, realizing he wasn't swayed. "So you thought," he replied evenly. "You thought about yourself, about Marcus, and about money, not about our marriage, not about me, not about the truth." The silence stretched between them, thick and oppressive. Finally, she forced herself to speak again, her voice a mere whisper. "I know I don't deserve forgiveness, Gabriel, but I'm begging you to let go of the hate. Not for me, but for yourself." Gabriel took a deep breath, leaning back in his chair as he studied her. There was truth in her words, and he knew it. Carrying the anger had been a burden. Even though it was a burden he felt she'd earned. But something had changed. He no longer felt the need for vengeance or retribution. Her suffering had already begun, and he could see it plain as day. "I don't hate you, Daisy," he said slowly, watching the surprise flicker in her eyes. Not anymore. But I also don't forgive you. She looked down, nodding numbly, absorbing his words. Tears streaked down her face as she took a shaky breath. I understand. He continued, his voice steady and final. You're right. Letting go of hate is for me. But forgiveness? That's for people who deserve it. You, Daisy, took everything good we had and destroyed it. He shook his head. I've moved on. I have no room in my life for someone who could hurt me the way you did. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. She looked utterly defeated, a shell of the woman she once was. Finally, she managed to say, I'll always regret what I did, and I'll always love you, Gabriel. In my own way. A small, humorless smile tugged at the corners of his mouth. Love? He repeated, the words sounding foreign. Maybe you believe that, but that doesn't change anything now. Slowly, Gabriel stood, taking one last look at her. She seemed to shrink under his gaze, her shoulders slumping, as if the weight of everything she had done was finally pressing down on her. Goodbye, Daisy, he said softly, a note of finality in his voice. As he turned to walk away, she called after him one last time, her voice desperate and raw. Gabriel, please don't leave me like this. I have nothing left. He stopped but didn't turn around. You have what you chose, Daisy. I've chosen to move on. Without another word, he walked out of the cafe, leaving her behind. As he stepped into the cool night air, he felt the last fragments of his past slipping away, the weight of betrayal lifting from his shoulders. There was a strange peace in his heart, a calmness he hadn't felt in a long time. And as he looked up at the stars, he knew that he was finally free. Free to start over. Free to live without the shadows of lies and deceit. It was the beginning of a new chapter, one where he could define his life on his own terms, unbound from the past. The final chapter of Gabriel's old life was closed, and he found himself stepping into a new world that felt entirely his own. The fresh start was daunting, yes, but it was also liberating. For so many years, his life had been entwined in Daisy's lies, caught in a web he didn't even know he was tangled in. Now, he was free to shape his days as he wished, and that freedom brought him a quiet sense of joy he hadn't experienced in years. In the mornings, Gabriel embraced his solitude, filling his time with things he had once overlooked. He'd started running, taking long jogs through the nearby park, breathing in the fresh air as he cleared his mind. Each step felt like shedding another piece of his past. Each morning felt like washing away another layer of bitterness and resentment. The isolation that had once felt heavy and burdensome now felt comforting. This was a time for him to reconnect with himself. As he let go of old routines and discovered new ones, he met people who gradually filled his life with new perspectives. One evening, a friend invited him to a small gathering, and he hesitated before agreeing. He wasn't sure if he was ready to meet new people, but a part of him was curious. At that gathering, he met Olivia, a woman with a quiet strength and a warm smile that put him at ease immediately. Their conversation began with small talk, but quickly deepened. Gabriel found himself talking about his journey, touching on the pain and betrayal without delving into specifics. Olivia listened intently, nodding as he spoke, her eyes reflecting an empathy that made him feel seen and understood. It sounds like you've been through more than anyone should have to bear, she said softly, her gaze steady. But you're here, rebuilding yourself. That takes courage. Her words struck him, and he realized just how far he'd come. It's been a long road, he admitted, but I'm finally starting to see the light at the end. Over the following months, Olivia became a steady presence in Gabriel's life. She was patient, allowing him to set the pace, never pressing him to share more than he was comfortable with. They spent time getting to know each other over quiet dinners, weekend hikes, and late-night conversations. She had her own stories, her own share of scars, and they found comfort in each other's journeys. One evening, as they sat on a park bench watching the sunset, Olivia reached over and took his hand. Gabriel, she said, her voice gentle, I want you to know that I'm here for you. For all of you, your past, your present, and whatever future we may have. I know trust isn't easy for you, and I don't take that lightly. He looked at her, feeling the warmth of her hand in his, and realized just how much she had come to mean to him. Thank you, Olivia. Trusting again, it hasn't been easy. But with you, I feel like maybe it's possible. In the months that followed, Gabriel found himself opening up to love again, little by little. With Olivia, he learned that trust could be rebuilt, even after it had been shattered so deeply. She taught him that healing was a process, and that he didn't have to rush it. With her, he felt a sense of hope and security that he had never thought he would feel again. Their relationship wasn't perfect. There were days when memories of the past would creep in, darkening his thoughts. But Olivia understood, giving him space when he needed it and gently reminding him that she was there to support him. One night, after a quiet dinner at Olivia's home, Gabriel took a deep breath, deciding to share a part of his story he had kept guarded. "I want you to know everything, Olivia," he began, his voice barely a whisper. "The betrayal I went through, it was more than I ever thought I could handle. There were days I didn't think I'd get through it." She reached out, touching his hand gently. "You don't have to tell me everything now, Gabriel. But I'm here, ready to listen whenever you're ready." He looked into her eyes, seeing nothing but understanding and patience. "I think I'm ready," he said, his voice stronger now. And for the first time, he shared the full weight of his story, the lies, the betrayal, the confrontation, and the slow, painful path to rebuilding himself. She listened without interruption, her expression unwavering. When he finished, she took a deep breath and squeezed his hand. "You're stronger than you know, Gabriel, and I'm honored that you trust me with this. You've been through hell, but you came out the other side. That's something to be proud of." For the first time, Gabriel felt a sense of peace wash over him. He had come a long way, and he was finally ready to let go of the remnants of his past, embracing this new chapter with Olivia by his side. Across town, in a rundown, dimly lit apartment, Daisy and Marcus's lives had unraveled entirely. Without their wealth, without their friends, they had become shadows of the people they once were. Their days were filled with regret and bitterness, haunted by memories of a life they had willingly destroyed. Marcus spent most of his time in silence, drowning in his own guilt, while Daisy's attempts to reach out to people had only resulted in rejection and shame. She had tried to rebuild her life, but every memory, every moment, was tainted by the choices she had made. The friends who once admired her success and charm now wanted nothing to do with her. She was isolated, left to confront the truth of her own actions. For Daisy, every day was a reminder of what she had lost, of the family she had betrayed. The emptiness gnawed at her, a constant, hollow ache. She had tried to move on with Marcus, but even he seemed like a stranger now. The bond they had once shared, fueled by secrecy and deceit, had withered into resentment and distrust. Meanwhile, Gabriel rarely thought about them. He had built a new life, a life filled with love, trust, and peace. The shadows of the past no longer haunted him, and he had learned that true healing came from within. As he stood one morning, watching the sun rise with Olivia by his side, Gabriel felt a profound sense of gratitude. He had endured unimaginable pain, but he had emerged stronger, wiser, and ready to embrace the future. And for the first time in years, he felt free.